May 8, 1945. The guns had fallen silent across Europe. In the pale morning light of a makeshift processing center near Regensburg, Germany, a column of exhausted women shuffled forward through mud still wet from spring rain. Their field gray uniforms hung loose on frames hollowed by months of rationing. Auxiliary Corps members, communication specialists, nurses who had served too close to the front, they moved with the mechanical precision of those who had forgotten what it meant to choose their own direction. The air carried the smell of diesel fuel and damp canvas, mixing with something else, something unfamiliar and almost obscenely sweet. One woman, Oberhelfer Margaret Hoffmann, a 23-year-old signals operator from Stuttgart, stopped mid-step when the scent reached her. Her eyes, ringed with exhaustion, searched for its source. What she saw made her forget, just for a moment, that she was a prisoner of war. An American soldier, impossibly young beneath his helmet, stood beside a field kitchen holding a bottle of dark liquid that caught the weak sunlight like amber glass. He was drinking it casually, carelessly, as if such abundance required no explanation. Behind him, white tents stretched in orderly rows, and from somewhere came the sound of laughter, actual laughter, and the hiss of something cooking on a griddle. Margaret had not laughed in 8 months. She had not seen fresh meat in longer than that. The contrast between what she had been taught to expect and what now unfolded before her eyes created a cognitive dissonance so profound that she would later tell American intelligence officers she thought, in that first moment, that she had died and arrived in some peculiar afterlife where the victors drank mysterious potions and smiled. This was not how defeat was supposed to appear. To understand the shock that rippled through tens of thousands of German women taken prisoner in the final months of World War II, one must first comprehend the narrative they had carried into captivity. From 1943 onward, as the Reich's military situation deteriorated, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had worked overtime to prepare the German population for the possibility of occupation. The message was consistent, brutal, and designed to inspire terror. American soldiers were portrayed as culturally inferior mongrels, their nation a thin veneer of civilization stretched over barbarism. Soviet forces were depicted as Asiatic hordes bent on rape and murder, but even the Americans, with their jazz music and racial integration, were painted as dangerous primitives who would show no mercy to German women. The Nazi propaganda film Seeds of Chaos, widely distributed in 1944, showed American soldiers looting churches and assaulting civilians. Radio broadcasts described prisoner of war camps as death factories where Germans would be starved in retaliation for real and imagined crimes. Goebbels himself, in a February 1945 speech recorded in his diary, noted that the regime's strategy was to make Germans more afraid of defeat than of death. For women in particular, the message was even more pointed. They were told that American occupation would mean systematic violation, that enemy soldiers viewed German women as legitimate spoils of war, that surrender meant a fate literally worse than death. Hundreds of thousands of German women served in auxiliary roles by 1945. They operated anti-aircraft batteries, served in communications networks, worked as nurses near combat zones, and staffed administrative positions throughout the crumbling Reich. As the front collapsed, these women found themselves in impossible positions, abandoned by retreating German forces, cut off from supply lines, facing enemy armies on all sides. When American forces swept through Germany in the spring of 1945, they encountered not just soldiers but an entire support infrastructure staffed largely by women who had been conditioned to expect the worst. The historical record shows that approximately 60,000 German women were processed through American prisoner of war facilities between March and August 1945. They came from every branch of service: Nachrichtenhelferin from signals units, Blitzmittel who had operated searchlights for anti-aircraft defenses, nurses from field hospitals, clerical staff from Wehrmacht headquarters. Most were between 18 and 30 years old. Most had eaten nothing but ersatz coffee and thin soup for weeks. Most believed they were being transported to their deaths. The first fracture in that belief came not from speeches or reassurances, but from food. Oberhelfer Hoffmann's testimony, recorded by American military psychologists in June 1945 as part of a study on prisoner morale, describes her first 24 hours in American custody with the precision of someone still processing disbelief. After initial processing, fingerprints, brief interrogation, confiscation of military insignia, she and 200 other women were directed to a mess tent. The line moved slowly. Women whispered to each other, sharing rumors. Someone said the Americans were fattening them before execution, like livestock. Someone else said the food would be drugged. Margaret, whose father had owned a bakery before the war, said nothing. She simply watched the American cooks moving behind steam tables with an efficiency that seemed almost theatrical. When her turn came, a soldier she later described as impossibly large, with hands like ham hocks, placed items on her metal tray without ceremony. First, a hamburger, though Margaret did not yet know this word. She saw meat, real meat, dark and glistening with fat, sandwiched between soft white bread that had clearly never seen sawdust or ground turnip filler. Beside it, he added a scoop of something she recognized as potato, though prepared in a way she had never seen, thin golden strips, crispy and salted. Then came a small bowl of green beans swimming in butter. Real butter. She could smell it. Finally, as if in defiance of everything she understood about wartime scarcity, he placed a bottle of Coca-Cola on her tray, the glass beaded with condensation, impossibly cold. "Eat," he said in broken German, gesturing toward the tables. Margaret sat. Around her, 200 women stared at their trays with expressions ranging from confusion to something approaching grief. A former nurse from Hamburg began to cry, silently, tears running down her face as she picked up the hamburger with trembling hands. Another woman, a radar operator from Berlin, simply stared at the food without moving. Somewhere near the back, a voice whispered, "Is this real?" The question hung in the air unanswered, because none of them were certain anymore what real meant. Margaret bit into the hamburger. The meat was warm, seasoned with salt and pepper, cooked through but still tender. The bread was soft enough that her teeth sank through it without resistance. For the first time in 18 months, she tasted actual beef, not horse meat, not mystery sausage made from sawdust and hope, but beef from a cow that had apparently lived a life of sufficient comfort to develop proper fat content. The sensation was so overwhelming that she had to stop eating. Her stomach, shrunken from months of inadequate rations, cramped immediately. She took a small sip of the Coca-Cola to settle it. The liquid in the bottle was unlike anything in her experience. Sweet, yes, but not with the heavy treacly sweetness of sugar beet syrup or the metallic tang of saccharin. This was something else entirely, a bright, almost aggressive sweetness cut with something acidic, something that bubbled and fizzed against her tongue. It was cold enough that her teeth ached. She took another sip, then another. By the time the bottle was half empty, she had begun to cry. Years later, interviewed by historians documenting the occupation period, Hoffman would struggle to explain that moment. "It was not gratitude," she insisted. "How could I feel grateful to the enemy? It was not relief exactly, though I was relieved not to be dead. It was something else. It was the realization that everything we had been told was a lie. Not just about the Americans, though that too. But about everything. About the war, about sacrifice, about what we were fighting for. They told us that Germany was hungry because we were strong, because we were unified, because we were pure. They told us the Americans were weak, mongrelized, spiritually empty. And then I sat in that tent holding a bottle of sweetened water that cost more to manufacture and refrigerate than our weekly ration allowance, and I understood that we had lost not just the war but the entire argument." The historical documentation of conditions in American prisoner of war camps for German women reveals a systematic approach that seemed designed, whether intentionally or not, to demonstrate American material superiority through the language of abundance. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be fed rations equivalent to those provided to the captor nation's own troops. The Americans, with their unbroken supply lines and industrial capacity operating at full capacity, interpreted this requirement generously. Daily caloric intake for female prisoners in American custody averaged between 2,500 and 3,000 calories. More than German civilians had received since 1943, and substantially more than Wehrmacht rations in the final year of the war. Breakfast included eggs, bacon, toast with butter, and coffee made from actual coffee beans. Lunch featured sandwiches, soup, and fruit. Dinner rotated through various iterations of the American understanding of proper meal structure: pot roast, fried chicken, meatloaf, all accompanied by vegetables and starches prepared with a casualness that spoke to unlimited access. But it was the extras that broke psychological barriers. Red Cross packages distributed weekly included cigarettes, chocolate bars, and chewing gum, items that had essentially vanished from civilian Germany by 1944. Prison canteens, established within weeks of the initial influx of prisoners, sold additional items using scrip earned through voluntary work details: candy bars, magazines, toiletries, and yes, Coca-Cola. The bottles arrived by the truckload, part of the military supply chain that kept American forces equipped with everything from ammunition to soft drinks. Coca-Cola's role in World War II was itself a study in American industrial capacity. The company had convinced the War Department that its product was essential for morale, and by 1945, there were 64 bottling plants operating in various theaters of war. The familiar bottle, with its distinctive contour and script logo, had become a symbol of American culture so pervasive that German propaganda had mocked it specifically. Now, German prisoners drank it by the case. Lieutenant Sarah Jennings, a nurse with the Women's Army Corps assigned to the Prisoner Processing Center at Mannheim, kept detailed notes during her 6-month deployment. Her diary entries, now housed in the National Archives, provide a counterpoint to the German perspective. On May 15, 1945, She wrote, "The German women are nothing like what we were told to expect. They're not monsters or fanatics. They're just scared, hungry girls who look at a Hershey bar like it's made of gold." One of them asked me today if the chocolate was real or made from ersatz. She couldn't believe we had enough real chocolate to give it to prisoners. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain abundance to someone who's forgotten what it looks like? A week later, she added, "They're starting to understand that we're not going to hurt them." Yesterday, a woman who'd been operating anti-aircraft searchlights near Frankfurt asked me if it was true that American soldiers could request different meals if they didn't like what was being served. I told her about mess hall menus and substitutions and special dietary requests. She looked at me like I'd claimed we could fly. She said, "In Germany, you ate what you were given, and if you complained, you were unpatriotic." I think that moment, realizing that our soldiers could be picky about food, affected her more than any propaganda film could have. The ice cream arrived in late May, delivered in refrigerated trucks that seemed to several witnesses like something from a fever dream. Industrial ice cream production had ceased in Germany in 1942, when the Reich Economics Ministry banned the manufacture of non-essential foodstuffs. The rationale was obvious. Why waste milk, sugar, and energy on frozen desserts when those resources could support the war machine? By 1945, most Germans under the age of 10 had never tasted ice cream. Many of the women in American custody could barely remember it. The American military, by contrast, had decided that ice cream was essential for morale and had invested millions in portable ice cream manufacturing facilities. Floating ice cream barges accompanied the Pacific Fleet. Bomber crews received ice cream as a reward for completed missions. And now, in a prisoner of war camp outside Munich, German women stood in line holding small paper cups while American soldiers scooped vanilla ice cream from industrial containers. Gertrude Weiss, a former Wehrmacht communications officer from Leipzig, described the experience in a letter to her sister, written in June 1945 and intercepted by censors but preserved in the historical record. "Liesel," she wrote, "you will not believe what I am about to tell you, and if you repeat it, people will say the hunger has driven me mad. Yesterday, the Americans gave us ice cream. Real ice cream, Liesel, made from cream and sugar and vanilla. It was cold enough that it hurt to eat quickly. I had not tasted anything sweet beyond saccharin in 3 years. I had not tasted anything cold beyond water from the pump. I stood there with my little cup, crying like a child, while the American soldier who had served me looked uncomfortable, as if he could not understand what was wrong. What was wrong was that nothing was wrong. We were prisoners. We had lost everything. Our country was in ruins. And here I stood, eating ice cream on a warm May afternoon, surrounded by women who should have been my enemies but who instead handed out frozen milk as if it cost nothing to produce." She continued, "Do you remember what they told us about the Americans? That they were soft, that their love of luxury made them weak, that their material excess was a sign of spiritual poverty? I understood yesterday why we lost. It was not because we lacked courage or discipline or will. It was because we were fighting an enemy who could afford to give ice cream to prisoners while simultaneously maintaining armies on 3 continents. How do you defeat that? How do you defeat a nation so wealthy it refrigerates dessert for people it would have been justified in executing?" The psychological impact of such abundance went beyond simple gratitude or relief. American military psychologists, conducting studies throughout 1945 and 1946, documented what they termed ideological collapse among German prisoners. This was not mere acceptance of defeat, that was common across all captured German forces. This was something deeper, a fundamental questioning of the narrative that had justified the entire war. Major David Klein, a psychiatrist attached to the European Theater of Operations, interviewed more than 300 German female prisoners as part of a study on denazification effectiveness. His report, submitted in December 1945, noted, "The prisoners consistently describe a moment of realization, often triggered by something mundane: food, toiletries, medical care. They describe having been told that National Socialism represented the peak of German achievement, that the Führer had created a system superior to decadent democracies. Then they experience American abundance firsthand, and the cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. One subject told me, 'We died for butter.' They fought a war on 3 fronts and still had butter." Another said, "I saw an American soldier throw away half a chocolate bar because he didn't want it anymore. Just throw it away. In that moment, I understood we had been lied to about everything." The Coca-Cola bottle became, in those strange months of 1945, a recurring symbol in prisoner accounts. It appeared in diaries, letters, sketches, and later memoirs with unusual frequency. Part of this was simple ubiquity. The bottles were everywhere, cheap enough that prisoners could purchase them regularly from canteens. But the bottle itself, with its distinctive shape and globally recognized logo, carried symbolic weight beyond its contents. To the German women, the Coca-Cola bottle represented several things simultaneously. It was proof of American industrial capacity, that a nation at war could maintain production of a frivolous beverage and distribute it globally. It was proof of supply chain superiority, that these bottles could arrive cold at a prison camp in Bavaria while German forces had struggled to deliver basic ammunition to the front. It was proof of cultural confidence, that Americans felt no need to conserve or ration even small luxuries. And perhaps most significantly, it was proof that the propaganda had been wrong. Goebbels' propaganda machine had mocked Coca-Cola specifically as a symbol of American cultural emptiness. The drink appeared in cartoons as a representation of capitalist excess, mindless consumption, racial mixing, through its association with drugstores and public spaces, and spiritual poverty. To drink Coca-Cola was to participate in a culture that valued immediate pleasure over deeper meaning. Or so the argument went. But now, sitting in prison camps, drinking bottle after bottle of the stuff, German women encountered a troubling question. If American culture was so empty, so spiritually bankrupt, so focused on meaningless pleasure, why had it won? Why had the nation of Coca-Cola and hamburgers and ice cream defeated the nation of discipline and sacrifice and higher purpose? The question had no comfortable answer. Elizabeth Koenig, a former nurse who had served near the Eastern Front before being captured by American forces near Nuremberg, grappled with this question in her diary. I was taught, she wrote in June 1945, that suffering built character. That sacrifice made us strong. That Germany's willingness to endure hardship was proof of our superiority. I believed this. I watched my patients die from infected wounds because we had no antibiotics. I ate soup made from grass and called it strength. And now I sit in an American camp, drinking a sweet beverage created for no purpose except pleasure, and I have to confront the possibility that all that suffering was pointless. That we could have had butter and abundance and still been strong. That perhaps we were weak precisely because we believed suffering was virtue. This was the transformation that American abundance forced upon German prisoners, not through lectures or propaganda films or denazification programs, but through the simple, undeniable reality of a hamburger, a bottle of Coca-Cola, a cup of ice cream. The physical fact of American plenty accomplished what arguments could not. It demonstrated, in language any hungry person could understand, that the American system worked. That democracy and capitalism, for all their apparent chaos and inefficiency, had produced a society capable of feeding its enemies better than the Reich had fed its loyal citizens. The medical records from American prisoner of war camps tell another part of this story. When German women first arrived in American custody, physicians routinely documented symptoms of malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, anemia, hormonal irregularities from insufficient fat intake, dental problems from lack of proper nutrition. Many had not menstruated in months, a common effect of prolonged caloric restriction. Their bodies were, quite literally, shutting down non-essential functions to survive. Within weeks of consistent American rations, these conditions began to reverse. Captain Martha Rodriguez, an army physician who worked at the processing center in Wiesbaden, documented the changes in monthly reports. The transformation is remarkable, she wrote in July 1945. Women who arrived with prominent ribs and hollow cheeks are developing proper body composition. Menstrual cycles are resuming. Hair texture is improving. The psychological impact of this physical recovery cannot be overstated. Many of these women had come to accept their declining health as normal, as a necessary sacrifice. Watching their bodies recover, they're forced to confront what that sacrifice actually cost them. The provision of feminine hygiene products, readily available, free, and provided without comment or rationing, had its own powerful effect. In Germany, such items had been scarce and expensive since early in the war. Many women had resorted to improvised solutions, rags washed and reused, paper when available. The casual American distribution of commercial sanitary napkins, as if such things were unremarkable, reinforced the same message as the food: abundance was possible. Women did not have to suffer. Comfort was not a betrayal of higher principles. Dental care provided another revelation. American military dentists, following standard protocols, offer basic dental services to prisoners. Many German women had not seen a dentist in years. Some had pulled their own teeth rather than endure untreated infections. The availability of pain medication, of anesthetic, of proper tools and trained practitioners, of cavity fillings and extractions performed with care rather than urgency, all of this spoke to a society that had maintained civilian standards of medical care even during total war. One prisoner, whose name appears in records only as Subject 47F, told an interviewer, "In Germany, we were told that pain made us strong. That to complain about discomfort was weakness. I had an infected tooth for 7 months. It hurt to eat, to speak, to exist. I thought this was what war required. Then an American dentist pulled it out in 5 minutes, gave me pills for the pain, and acted like this was normal. Like of course you wouldn't be expected to live with that pain. Like suffering wasn't a virtue. I think that changed something in me more than any speech about democracy could have. As summer progressed and the immediate chaos of war's end settled into the slightly less chaotic reality of occupation, the prisoner camps took on unexpected characteristics. Work details were voluntary, and most prisoners volunteered, partly from boredom, partly from a desire for the additional canteen privileges that came with work. Women with clerical skills were assigned to administrative offices. Those with language abilities worked as translators. Former nurses assisted in medical facilities. This created unusual situations where German prisoners worked alongside American personnel in relatively normal circumstances. They ate lunch together, took smoke breaks at the same time, made small talk about weather and family. The casual egalitarianism of these interactions shocked many German women as much as the abundance had. Obergefreiter Anna Schiller, who worked in the motor pool at a camp near Frankfurt, wrote to her mother, "The Americans treat us like regular workers. Not like prisoners, not like former enemies, like employees. The sergeant I work for asks my opinion about supply requisitions. He says please and thank you. Yesterday, he shared his cigarettes with me when we were doing inventory. Not as a gift or a bribe, but the way you share with a colleague. I don't know what to make of this. Are they naive? Don't they understand we were trying to kill them 6 months ago? Or is this what they mean by democracy, that even enemies can become equals?" The American soldiers themselves, for the most part young draftees who had grown up during the Depression, often seemed confused by the German women's reactions to ordinary things. To a farm boy from Iowa, a hamburger was just a hamburger. To a factory worker from Detroit, Coca-Cola was simply what you drank. They had no framework for understanding that these mundane items represented a political statement to people who had lived through years of Nazi rationing propaganda. Private First Class James Kowalski, assigned to a prisoner camp in Bavaria, recorded his observations in letters home. "Ma," he wrote in June 1945, "the German girls act like they've never seen food before. Yesterday we had hamburgers for lunch, and one of the prisoners, she works in the laundry, stood there staring at it like it was going to vanish. I asked her what was wrong, and she said she hadn't eaten beef in 2 years. 2 years, Ma. I can't imagine it. Then she asked me if we had hamburgers often, and I told her we'd had them 3 times last week. She didn't believe me at first. She thought I was exaggerating. When I convinced her I was telling the truth, she looked like she might cry. I don't understand these people. They started a war that killed 50 million people, and now they're crying over hamburgers." Kowalski's confusion was understandable but missed the deeper point. The tears were not about hamburgers precisely. They were about the shattering of an ideology. About understanding that the narrative that had structured their entire adult lives, that Germany was strong because Germans were willing to suffer, that the enemy was decadent and weak, was provably false. The hamburger was just the delivery mechanism for that realization. By August 1945, as the war in the Pacific ended and the full scope of Nazi atrocities became public knowledge through the Nuremberg trials, the strange interlude of the prisoner camps began to close. Women were processed for release, classified according to their level of Nazi party involvement, and sent home to a Germany that no longer existed as they had known it. They returned to bombed cities, divided occupation zones, and a population traumatized by defeat and revelation. Many carried with them not just memories but physical artifacts of their imprisonment. Coca-Cola bottles, kept as souvenirs. Hershey bar wrappers, pressed flat and saved. Photographs taken by sympathetic American guards. Empty tin cans that had once held American peaches or condensed milk. These objects, preserved in attics and basements, would later appear in museums and historical archives, mute testimony to a peculiar moment in history. The psychological impact of those months in American custody rippled through the subsequent decades. The women who experienced it, who tasted Coca-Cola and hamburgers and ice cream while wearing prisoner uniforms, became living contradictions to the Nazi narrative they had once believed. Many became quietly pro-American in the post-war years, skeptical of both communist propaganda from the East and lingering Nazi sympathies in the West. They had seen, in the most direct way possible, what American abundance looked like. They had been on the receiving end of a system that could afford generosity toward enemies. Margaret Hoffman, the signals operator whose story opened this account, lived until 2003. In her final years, she gave several interviews to historians documenting the occupation period. She always returned to that first day in American custody, to the moment she tasted Coca-Cola for the first time. "People ask me," she said in a 2001 interview, if I hated the Americans for defeating us. But how could I hate someone who fed me when I was hungry? How could I hate a system that gave me medical care and warm clothes and treated me like a human being? The Nazis told us we were fighting for civilization against barbarians. Then the supposed barbarians gave us ice cream. You cannot maintain ideological purity in the face of ice cream. It sounds absurd, I know. But it's true. The story of German women prisoners encountering American abundance is, in the end, a story about the material basis of ideology. National Socialism had built its appeal partly on claims of German superiority, superior discipline, superior will, superior character. These qualities, the propaganda insisted, would triumph over American materialism and spiritual emptiness. Germany would win not because it was richer, but because it was better.